Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It doesn't matter where you live. You've heard these awful news reports that all seem to end the same way.
From police, we're finding out who the 21-year-old alleged shooter is, that he had an extensive criminal background, and that he was in fact out on bail at the time that this happened.
Mackenzie was again charged with several firearms-related offenses and assault of a police officer. Still, he was released on bail in June and was supposed to return to court in September, but didn't show up.
Toronto police have arrested one of three suspects following the fatal shooting of an innocent bystander here in Leslieville last week. And we have learned that the suspect was out on bail at the time of the incident.
Listen, it is frightening. Truly. And naturally, something frightening that hits so close to home for so many is the perfect fuel for the political fire.
He gets released on bail and shoots a police officer. When will this government finally accept that their hug-a-thug, catch-and-release system is putting our people at risk?
Bail reform has been a hot topic in Canada for years now, through two very different attempts to reform it, over the past decade, in fact. The debate is far more complicated than you've probably been led to believe. It's not as simple as locking up the thugs who commit these horrible crimes. Nor is it as simple as ensuring that no one is held in custody before they've been found guilty. So what exactly is it then? I'm glad you asked. I'm Jordan Heath-Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Nicole Myers is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Queen's University. Her research focuses on the Canadian bail system. Hello, Nicole.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today.
Do we know, and I don't even know if we keep these statistics, do we know how many people are quote unquote out on bail at any given time?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, this is one of the biggest difficulties that we have. I mean, aside from moving away from the challenges of people being hurt, but that we really do lack high quality systematic data across the country, and we even lack it in a more localized way, so that we're unable to say with any accuracy, how many people are on bail right now. Of the people who are on bail, how many people successfully complete their bail without committing an offense? Because that's sort of the flip of this, that we very often hear about the tragic and the very serious, but embedded in that is the success of many folks within this system.
And you can tell me, obviously, if I'm wrong, but these tragedies that we're talking about, and we played a montage of them in the intro, aren't just happening now. Like, this is stuff that has happened as long as we've had a bail system. So can you kind of give us some context about when and why bail reform became such a big political issue in Canada? Like, was there a tipping point where this just got in front of everybody?
I think that's a good question, because I think everything you said is true and accurate. And I was thinking about sort of, when did we see this shift? And if I can just take one moment to go back a little bit further in history. So if we look at Canada, the issue with our population in pretrial detention, we started really seeing markers that was an issue in the early 2000s or so. And then year after year after year, we continued to see more and more people being held in pretrial detention. And that meant that when we looked at our provincial institutions, more and more people are in there who are legally innocent than are there who have been convicted and sentenced to be there to serve a sentence. And so this starts in the early 2000s, and we continue to see this getting, the numbers of the disparity growing and growing. And we're starting to also at that time hear some more concerns, very legitimate concerns, about the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in custody, of Black people, of other folks that are marginalized in the community with mental health or substance use issues. And so we see that there's a particular population who is likely experiencing this more and having more difficulties that flow from this. And then in a fairly substantial report that I co-authored with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association that came out in 2014, we really were trying to highlight these kinds of ongoing issues and the disproportionate impact on certain groups. We then, in sort of 2019, is when Bill C-75 ends up coming into effect. So there's a bit of a lead up on time on that. But what we're really seeing here was a response to the Supreme Court of Canada's decision in R versus Antic that said, we need to centralize this principle of restraint, that we don't want to hold people in custody unnecessarily. And if we're releasing them into the community, we want to make sure that the conditions or the supervision we're imposing are reasonable to comply with.
Why don't you stop for a second and explain that precedent-setting case then, R versus Antic?
Absolutely. So in this particular case, it was a unanimous decision by the Supreme Court of Canada, sending a very clear message that we have a problem with our bail system, that we are simply holding far too many folks inside for lengthy periods of time, and that what has sort of happened is sort of a move away from the very central and fundamental principles about how our system is supposed to operate, centering things like the right to be presumed innocent, the right to reasonable bail. And so the Supreme Court was saying, we really have to be very restrained that, yes, there are some people that need to be detained. They are too risky of fleeing and not coming back, or they're too risky of causing harm in the community. But we want to be really selective and really careful about who it is we decide to keep in custody at the front end when you are considered legally innocent of the allegations. And so the Supreme Court came out and was saying, we have to be more restrained in this, and we need to be sort of mindful of the disproportionate impact. And so much of what Bill C-75 was a few years later was really the House encoding much of what the Supreme Court had already said in its ruling. So there was nothing terribly dramatic about what was being proposed with C-75, just an encoding of what the Supreme Court was saying. And then C-75 also, it said that decision makers really need to think about the circumstances of Indigenous people and other vulnerable groups that are overrepresented. And it increased the police's power to be able to release accused and provided them with an additional available option, what they were called as judicial referral hearings. And this is when an officer comes across somebody and there's allegations that they have failed to comply with the condition of their release, rather than automatically arresting them and detaining them and keeping them for bail. Police had an additional option that they could consider to send somebody back to court without having to arrest them first, so that bail order could be reevaluated and reconsidered.
I just want to make sure that I get this straight. We had been, since the early 2000s, increasing the percentage of people that were not granted bail until the Supreme Court made this decision and the House codified it. What happened after that? Has the number of people detained without bail continued to rise, or did it go down?
The course has remained largely the same, that we're continuing to see growth in the number of people in pretrial detention and the proportions. So, for example, tonight when any of us go to bed, there are just over 16,000 people in pretrial detention who are legally innocent, but are nonetheless being held in jail. And if we look at sort of like the proportions of, in our provincial jails, what proportion are there who are legally innocent and what proportion are there who have been convicted and sentenced, we're looking at 73% of the population in our jails are there in pretrial detention. They have not been convicted of anything. Now, they may at some point, but they haven't yet.
Right.
And we need to be sort of very mindful that just because there's been allegations made by the police or someone's been arrested, it doesn't mean that the mistakes don't get made or there's not an appropriate legal defense. And at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge that half of all of the cases in Canada end up resulting in the charges being stayed or withdrawn. That means the person's not convicted. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But that's a very significant proportion of people that start in our system and then do not end up being convicted of what we've alleged that they've done.
So the percentage of people in pretrial detention keeps going up. Meanwhile, the demand for bail reform also keeps growing louder. Am I wrong, or are those two things at odds?
It does seem at odds to me. And I mean, as you've referenced, we had some very serious events. I mean, much of this, I think, was instigated by the tragic death of the OPP officer, Paris Chawla, in December of 2022. And that seemed to sort of really reinvigorate this debate and conversation, and a real sort of pushback of seeing Bill C-75 as somehow making our bail system really easy and super lenient. And it didn't do any of those things. If anything, it has not had the kind of impact that was intended of, emphasizing the importance of restraint and trying to reduce the size of our pretrial detention population. After the death of the officer, we then sort of see more and more calls for bail reform. You may recall sort of a joint letter from all of the premiers and ministers in the territories to the federal government saying that we need to do something. The criminal law is the federal government's responsibility. You need to change the law. And the federal government did respond with Bill C-48 that received royal assent at the beginning of 2024. And this particular legislation seems to be sort of a pushback against Bill C-75. It created more reverse onus situations trying to target people who've, that have allegedly committed serious offenses or repeat violence or using weapons, and has provided some other sort of mechanisms that are ostensibly meant to make getting bail more difficult.
From the people who are pushing the idea that we are letting criminals out on the streets to reoffend, what would they like to actually change about the system that they say would fix that?
I mean, I think that some of that's also the difficulty of that, these kind of comments come out without necessarily any substance or sort of meaningful action that can take place. So we stay in the space of rhetoric of, do we need jail, not bail, or we have this revolving door system. And so it suggests then that either like the law is the problem and we need to make it more strict, but our law already allows us to detain people. And given the numbers and proportions, we don't have a hard time keeping people in detention. It's difficult to get bail. So there's a look to go like, we need to fix the law, or that we somehow, that decision makers need to make more detention decisions and hold more people in custody. And the difficulty is that, simply making an adjustment to the law is unlikely to have a huge and significant impact. That these kinds of tragic events that are happening, they're serious and they do feel like they're happening more often, but they are still very relatively isolated incidents. And so we can absolutely look at that individual bail decision and go, yeah, maybe there's a problem with how that was made, what information wasn't available. We can do that kind of an analysis. But I think we need to be very careful to take what's happened in one specific case and apply it in broad strokes. If anything, some of the biggest problems with our system are not going to be able to be addressed by making small tinkers to the law.
You mentioned that when these incidents happen, and yeah, to be fair, like there have been, or at least it seems there have been a bunch of them lately, and they certainly grab headlines and they're awful. Do we have any idea if they are happening more often? How would we understand that?
We don't know. I mean, there's nowhere for us to turn to get this kind of data, and it's incredibly frustrating because some of these questions they're not just very important. They're incredibly simple questions. This should be the kind of data that should be readily available so that we can make informed decisions. And
Nicole, do you have any idea how many experts on this show have said that about various topics across this country?
All right, so I'm joining an esteemed crew of folks.
A loud chorus.
It's frustrating because on the one hand, collecting data and doing it well, I mean, it's tricky and there's things involved with it, but I don't know how you can properly assess where we are and then make changes and see if we've improved if we don't have some of the very basic measures on which we might be able to make that kind of an assessment.
How do we come up with a bail system that is fair and equitable, knowing that there are various degrees of inequality when it comes to Indigenous and other marginalized people, but also knowing that people do reoffend, and those are the kind of incidents that, like it or not, move the needle of public opinion?
Absolutely. And I think some of what our issue is we have a volume problem. Our courts are backlogged and overwhelmed by the caseload that comes through and then the different inefficiencies that come from trying to process such a huge caseload. And so what that tells us is there's a lot of minor or relatively minor stuff that's coming into the courts. But in more minor stuff coming in, it's taking away the time and the resources for those who work in the courts to more closely examine a file, to pursue other areas of inquiry, to think about things carefully, that if we can find alternative ways to keep as many people as possible simply out of the system without bringing them in, it allows the system to focus much more on that which is more serious or more risky and be able to try to craft a decision that is well-informed and supported by the information that's available.
You mentioned that the government passed C-48 in effect to push back a little bit against, I guess, its own policy from a few years earlier. We all know, whether it's this year or sometime next year, there's about to be an election. The Conservatives are leading by a lot. Do we know anything specific about their policies on this issue?
I don't think anything has very specific come out other than sort of this general sense that the bail system is seen as broken and as something that needs to be change so that we can lock more people up. I think one of the difficulties that particularly comes up with the leader of the opposition is that it's very inflammatory kind of language and sentiments. And I do appreciate that people are upset. Public safety is a concern. And I think we can all agree we want to feel safe in the community. And we should. But my sort of interest is going, okay, well, what is the issue and how do we actually address this in an effective manner? And I'm not sure that's the kind of debate or conversation that's happening. I do have deep concerns that after the election that we may see bail as an area where further changes or restrictions are put in place that are designed to make a system much more difficult.
Do you have any examples of what that could look like? Because right now I'm trying to think of what kind of policy changes you could make that would quote unquote lock more people up.
Yes. I would reverse onus is to creating more situations where the accused has to demonstrate why they ought to be released versus why the Crown has to demonstrate that. I could see that as being sort of low-hanging fruit, not whether that would actually have an impact or not, I'm not quite clear on. But I think what is more likely to happen is going to be sort of a cooling effect on decision makers. So if we continue to have this sort of very inflammatory rhetoric, we continue to have examples of really tragic things happening, what you then see is sort of a further entrenchment of sort of a risk-averse mentality, a reluctance to be the one to make this release decision that could turn badly. And so it almost then in this fear of having to make difficult decisions will then result almost in not making decisions or falling back on that which is more conservative or more easily justifiable.
Can you explain a little bit more about the reverse onus policy and what that actually looks like in practice and what the flip would be?
So generally speaking, and for most offenses and situations, if the state is looking to detain somebody in custody, it's generally the Crown, the prosecutor, who bears that onus. It's up to them to demonstrate on the balance of probabilities to the court whether or not someone should be let in or out.
Okay.
In reverse onus situations, we take that onus and it gets flipped onto the accused person. Now, this happens in certain serious offenses. This may happen if they were already on release and now it's alleged that they've breached their bail. It's now their responsibility to demonstrate to the court why they ought to be released, rather than the state bearing that onus. And now, in some ways, that can be seen as it's meant to be more difficult. We could imagine that it might be more difficult for an accused person to demonstrate they should be released. There is some critiques about the reuse of reverse onus situations because we've got to acknowledge a very deep difference in the kind of power and resources that are available to the state versus an accused person. And it brings up some difficult questions of what it means to have to justify why you should maintain your liberty and stay in the community rather than the state bearing that onus.
Let me ask you this. Isn't bail to some degree always going to be a judgment call? How is it even possible to craft a policy that gets it right?
The short answer, yes, it is a judgment call. I mean, these are experienced folks. These are people that work in the system. They're making the best decisions they can with the information that's available and being mindful that they also are required to uphold our constitutional rights and they're required to follow the decision-making of the Supreme Court of Canada. But at the end of the day, regardless of, how many sort of things we want people to be thinking of or mindful of or weighing, at the end of the day, it's a judgment call. And most of the time, those judgment calls work out well. And then sometimes they don't. And that's tragic and it's awful. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the entire system or all of the decision makers don't know what they're doing.
In the meantime, before we finish, I want to ask you about the people that aren't granted bail. And now I'm afraid I have to ask you for more data, which you might not have. What do we know about how long pretrial detention can usually last? And do we know what percentage of people held in pretrial detention are eventually released and found innocent?
Great questions. No, we don't really have the data to be able to study those things, but I think you okay. Point out it does signal something quite important. So on average for folks in pretrial, you're looking at people spending about 7 days. That's the most recent data that we've been able to get from Statistics Canada, but there's huge variability in there. So what you have is a large number of people who are going to come in and spend a short amount of time, 1, 2, 3 days. And then a small number of people who are going to spend an incredibly long amount of time. They've been denied bail. They want to go to trial. They may stay in for years before their matters are resolved. So you've got these two different sort of populations. And what criminological evidence tells us, though, is that whether you're in custody for a short period of time or a long period of time, that time is criminogenic. time spent in jail makes it more, not less likely that people are going to commit offenses. And so we also want to be mindful that as much as we may want to hold people in, we want to prevent this, we need to do something, is that in doing so, we may be making them more risky rather than less risky, creating additional threats to public safety that will come out down the road rather than necessarily right in this moment. And a short period of time in custody is deeply destabilizing. If you imagine folks who for a few days, if you don't show up to work or school, these things might fall away, your access to children, medications, and other kinds of supports, the very kind of supportive and community-based services that are the most likely to prevent crime get disrupted by this process. And so again, some of it's this question of, are we interested in short-term public safety or long-term public safety? And maybe we're interested in both, but if we focus so short-term on, if we just lock everyone up at the front end, what ramifications does this have later on for making things worse rather than better? Any time that someone spends in pretrial detention on the front end is generally reduced off of the sentence that's imposed if they are convicted. And that can be a little bit tricky because it starts to make sentences look more lenient than they actually are because they are taking credit in from before. But during any time that people are in pretrial detention, there's no programming or services or rehabilitative, educational, any of those kinds of things. You need someone to be convicted before we can intervene in those ways. And so the more time people spend on the front end makes for shorter sentences on the back end, reducing our time to do that rehabilitative piece.
We've spent most of the time talking about people pushing for more strict bail, being politicians, being people who are making this a political fight. But there have also been advocacy groups, community groups like small business owners raising the issue of public safety, that their communities don't feel safe. And I know we don't have necessarily a perfect answer to that, but how would you respond to those concerns as opposed to the ones coming from people who are trying to win an election?
Absolutely. And they, as you point out, they're different concerns, but they're also quite similar and very understandably business owners and people that want to be, out in the community, they feel threatened, they don't feel safe. And whether that's in a physical violence way, or perhaps it's shop owners who are, witnessing a lot of property offenses happening in their business. And I think in some ways, there's sort of two different ways of looking at it. The one is going, okay, what do we know has an impact on crime? And that is keeping people in the community, providing supports, housing, mental health services, substance use supports, all of these different kinds of things will help reduce crime. And, they're expensive, and the pandemic went and disrupted all these kinds of things that are in place. But if we're looking at what's been happening sort of post-pandemic, some of this is because of a deterioration of that social safety net, that welfarist approach of taking care of folks. So there's the one element that involves those kinds of areas that we really need to focus our attention on if we're actually interested in doing something effective and to preserve public safety. The other is looking at our bail system and again going, okay, how do we best support police officers in exercising their discretion and making sure that they are able to use, for example, the judicial referral hearing if they determine that that's the most appropriate thing to do. And if then people are coming into the system going, okay, can we make this bail decision relatively quickly? And so that if you're coming in and you're going to be released back, let's get you back out into the community as quickly as possible. But then let's make sure that we've set up supports. If you're someone who is precariously housed, can we provide you with housing and a safe space to be? How do we make sure that the conditions that one has to comply with are reasonable and possible for someone to comply with, that we're not setting people up for failure? And how do we also provide some kind of, for example, supervision for people to make sure that we can keep track of them, but also more as an avenue for them to connect with the supportive resources that can help folks in their life.
Nicole, thank you so much for all of this. It's a pleasure to get a detailed breakdown of this political hot potato.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the time to speak about this. It's been a pleasure.
Nicole Myers, Associate Professor at Queen's University. That was The Big Story. For more from us, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca and find all of our episodes. You can also offer feedback on any one of those episodes or a future episode that you hope we'll do. In fact, I just checked our junk folder today as I was recording, and I realized some of your episode ideas went right there. So I have hopefully fixed that problem, and we have a whole whack of great ideas that we'll be looking into in the coming weeks. So thank you for those, and I'm sorry I missed them when you sent them. If you want to send more, the way to do that is by emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling 416-935-5935 and leaving a voicemail. The Big Story is available in all podcast players and all smart speakers when you ask them to play The Big Story podcast. Probably only ask them in Canada, though. If you ask them somewhere else, you might get a foreign podcast that is also named The Big Story. Just remember, we were there first. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.
Céline Dion.
My dream, to be international star.
Could it happen again? Could Celine Dion happen again?
I'm Thomas Leblanc, and Celine Understood is a 4-part series from CBC Podcasts and CBC News, where I piece together the surprising circumstances that helped manufacture Celine Dion, the pop icon. Celine Understood, available wherever you get your podcasts.